Centuries ago, seeds were sown that would grow our wealth. Eventually, these experiments with nature altered the world's technologies and thinking. It all links back to this ancient garden on the hill. Once, this was the seat of power, the resting place of pioneers and people of faith. It's a memory landmark of our childhood years and of our lives in modern times. The hill has seen all of the major events that shaped us into who we are today. From here, we can tell 7 centuries of our story, our history from the hills. Along the southern slopes of the hill is a section that has a special scent. These are remnants of a garden and an experiment. In 1822, Raffles, together with botanist Nathaniel Wallich, established a botanical and experimental garden at Fort Canning. It was started on the north side of the hill and extended eastwards, occupying areas including the former Anglo-Chinese School, Coleman Street, the Armenian Church, and the National Museum, an area that covered at least 19 hectares. One of the key reasons for the extensive enterprise was the need to find viable cash crops. And in the 19th century, it was anything spice. From around the 17th century, the European powers had been in the grips of spice mania.
It was the spices that only grew in Southeast Asia that first drew European ships to this region.
The Portuguese, and then the Dutch, and then the British, out to this part of the world to search for the pepper, the nutmeg, the cloves.
In those days, things like clove and nutmeg were worth literally more than their weight in gold. So if you sent a fleet of 5 ships from Europe to Southeast Asia to buy these spices, and all of them sunk but one, you would still make a killing.
The spice mania propelled experiments with nature. Nutmeg was the cash crop of hope. Hundreds of nutmeg trees and clove plants were established at the hill, while private landowners maintained massive plantations along Orchard Road.
The whole length of Orchard Road, on both sides, up to half a kilometre or more away from the road, were nutmeg orchards, and until the 1850s these were giving a lot of value and making people rich.
The Europeans weren't the only ones who were mad on spice. There was a lucrative market in China for pepper, and the supply chain included Chinese farmers in Singapore. They were here even before the British arrived. The farmers settled in areas marked unexplored territory and grew pepper and gambia, a climbing vine whose leaves were boiled down and used to tan leather. The farmers had a unique system of organization, which survived today in the term gang. The entire northern area used to be dotted with a land tenure system called gangzhu. What were they exactly? This was the question that led James Tan, a heritage blogger, on a mission.
Now, the Temanggung of Johor owned all the land, okay, but he didn't have the people to farm them. So very clever, he offered these lands to the Chinese farmers, right? And what he did was he issued a deed to them, okay? This is a letter authorizing you to farm the lands around Kranji, to farm the lands around the Sungai Bere River or the Pongo River, okay? Now, so much so that once you have this letter, which is called a Surat Sungai, okay, you are now the headman of that area and you started your farm there. Now, over time, the farm itself came to be known by the headman's name, okay? So much so that we now have Lim Chu Kang Chua Chu Kang, but there used to be places like Chan Chu Kang, Tan Chu Kang, Nam Tu Kang. In those days, we had a lot of Chu Kangs.
The Kang Chus were situated in the north because of abundant water supply.
Most of the Gambia farms were located around the rivers, okay, Kranji River, Pongo River, Serangoon River. You'll find that around these river lands, they were able to grow a lot of their Gambia.
For James, what started out as a curiosity ended with a personal discovery.
I wrote about my grand-uncle, who was a prominent politician in his time at Chua Chu Kang. And this reader wrote to me and asked, was the grandfather of my uncle the Kang Chu of Chua Chu Kang? I went back to my uncles, asked my uncles and started asking my relatives, do you know about this? Okay, and all of them actually came to the conclusion, yeah, there is some truth in that, but unfortunately at this moment we are still trying to piece all the ends together, to tie all the loose ends to see whether, yes, the Kang Chu of Chua Chu Kang was actually our great-great-grandfather.
By the mid-1800s, the land was filled with plantations of a range of cash crops. And then disaster struck. The nutmeg industry collapsed, killed by disease. A new cash crop was found, gutta-percha. This transformed world communications. Lying on the hill is Jose de Almeida, one of our pioneers of trade. He arrived as a doctor and became a major plantation owner. In 1843, de Almeida described a natural plastic material to the Royal Asiatic Society in London. It was called gutta-percha.
Not only was it waterproof and could be molded into any shape, a bit like plastics can now, but it was also an amazing electrical insulator.
Today, science historian John Van Wy hunts down the tree that used to grow wild and plentifully, and whose latex was the cash crop of the late 19th century.
Right, here we are at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. And from what I've read, what I'm looking for is just around this building, the Raffles building at Botanic Gardens. Ah, that's it. Well, this is one of the last gutta-percha trees in Singapore. This is the tree, the Singaporean tree, that changed the world. It produces a product very like rubber, an early form of rubber. It was waterproof. And it was the sap of this tree and trees like it from Singapore that first connected the world with electrical cables. It's sort of like the Victorian internet.
Gutta-percha is a resin from the Isonandra gutta tree, a native of our region.
The whole tree, both the trunk, the stems, the young stems, and the leaves, even the dead leaves, contain this very high-quality latex. And if you look in the newspapers at the latter part of the 19th century in Singapore, you will see companies were advertising for bushels of gutta leaves or gutta stem from which they could extract this latex.
The resin was used for a variety of things, from medical instruments to golf balls.
Why was gutta-percha so important? Well, if you're a golfer today, you might know that the first golf balls were made using gutta-percha. And if you go to your dentist today and you have root canal work done, your dentist may use gutta-percha to fill your root canal. So it's still a useful product.
In 1866, gutta-percha was successfully used to insulate cable wires across the Atlantic Ocean. And indirectly, Singapore had a role in changing world communications.
They understood how to use these telephone lines, if you like, for Morse code or whatever. But the thing is, they had to insulate the copper cable with something. And gutta-percha and white gutta, which has the same qualities, these are two different species, could be used to insulate those cables. So you can say that gutta-percha is actually a tree that has changed the world.
Gutta-percha grew in the wilds, but the method of harvest proved lethal to the tree.
They very often just cut the tree down. So there was no case of going back and harvesting more later on. You'd already destroyed the tree. So you got a single harvest from a tree, and then you had to go and find another tree.
So as the boom for gutta-percha exploded, the trees in Singapore were the first victims. The trees were killed and the sap that was so valuable was literally squeezed out of them. By the mid-1850s, all the gutta-percha trees in Singapore had been killed. And then it was necessary to move over to Johor to find any more of these valuable trees. So once again, a natural resource was found. It's found to be very valuable, and it was exhausted.
The British government pushed for experiments to plant gutta-percha trees. By this time, however, the experimental garden at Fort Canning had been dissolved. But the spirit of experimentation continued as land was added to an existing pleasure park at Napier Road. The extended space was called Economic Gardens, the predecessor of today's Botanic Gardens. It was in the new experimental gardens that a revolutionary cash crop was discovered. Rubber replaced gutta-percha as the new plastic. The man behind rubber's success was Henry Ridley, who innovated a method of tapping the tree without killing it. Today, the garden's latest director, Nigel Taylor, goes in search of rubber trees in the garden.
So in this part of the Botanic Gardens, we have a couple of young rubber trees that were planted on the 150th anniversary of the gardens in 2009. And this tree is already becoming mature. You could actually tap this tree if you wanted to for its latex. So Ridley would do a vertical cut down the trunk, and from that vertical trunk he would cut herringbone-like further slits connecting to the main channel that he'd made earlier, and the latex would then run down these slits and into the collecting central cut, and at the bottom there would be a cup in which the latex was collected. He understood the value of rubber, and he persuaded, by 1895, some locals in Malacca to plant the crop as an experiment. And within another 30 years, the rubber boom had established. And we know, for example, by 1920, Henry Ford's motor cars were running off the production line. They needed rubber tyres, and the demand for rubber had grown exponentially, and half of the world's supply was coming from Singapore and Malaya, and being exported through the port of Singapore. So the local agro-industry and the presence of this international free port were two key factors that combined to make Singapore and the peninsula of Malaysia a very wealthy place.
But the people to take the risk of planting that or developing estates was really a new generation of Chinese entrepreneurs. The Pranakans, Dr. Lim Boon Keng, among others, also recognized it and was prepared to put in money to develop the estate. So that is where in the 20th century you have got entrepreneurs like Li Kongqian, who made fortunes from developing rubber estates for this new plant.
The value of rubber in those years was a bit like plastic is today. Nowadays, everything is made of plastic. You can't go anywhere without seeing plastic. Well, before plastic was discovered, the only way to make such products was rubber. So rubber was waterproof. It could be formed into any shape. It was resilient. It was an electrical insulator. It had amazing properties. So it was extremely valuable, a very expensive cash crop.
The rubber latex would have been tapped in the rubber estates of Johor or Selangor, but the processing of that latex into clean rubber sheets that could then be exported, it could be smoked, was all done in Singapore. And so this arguably was Singapore's first industrial revolution.
The experiments with nature, which started at the hill, were now paying off. At the turn of the century, the view from the hill showed a boom town, one that was earning a place as a global player.
It was not only in the processing for export of the rubber, tin, or other staple products in the Peninsula, but also the marketing, the worldwide pricing of these products. So it's in Singapore that not only the tin market, the rubber market, but also the oil market, based on first the processing, the refining of oil from the Dutch East Indies, was established. Today, Singapore has become a major refining center and oil market. So we are continuing a 19th century tradition here.
But the view from the hill also revealed something rather startling. When Raffles ascended the hill, he saw a forested land. But by the time of the rubber boom, the landscape was highly urbanized, and the natural resources that had boosted the economy was fast disappearing. Raffles supported the botanical and experimental garden because he was a keen naturalist. The Victorian world was fascinated, if not obsessed, by natural history.
Both Raffles and Farquhar were very much men of the British Enlightenment. They were interested in the world around them, they were interested in nature. Raffles collected a huge amount of botanical, zoological specimens. So did Farquhar. Farquhar had a little zoo in his posting in Malacca. He accumulated a collection of natural history drawings documenting the natural history, the plants and the animals of this part of the world. So it was obvious that when they came to Singapore, they continued with this interest. They also commissioned artists to make drawings of what they found new, interesting. And Farquhar has left behind a collection of some 240 nature drawings that we have now in the National Museum.
Specimens of botanical beauties were collected and displayed proudly in Victorian homes. Huge sums of money were paid for these. In the mid-1800s, various adventurers came by on their way to the wilds of our region, collecting birds and insects for sale back in England. One of these adventurers was Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution through species selection.
Wallace went to all corners of the globe to collect birds and insects and send them back to Europe where they were sold. And one could make a very good living doing this. And at the same time, you could pursue your own researches in science.
Science historian John Van Wy is one of the world's leading Wallace scholars.
Well, Singapore was the hub of the wildlife trade in the region simply because it was the hub of the region, both in terms of trade, of ships, and of communication with the mail networks. So everything that Wallace collected throughout the entire region, every letter he wrote and received, all went through Singapore. Well, Wallace used Singapore as a base throughout his 8 years in Southeast Asia because it was the central place where he could get everything he needed, all of his supplies. This is where the mail was coming, and of course he could use the Singapore Library. So Wallace did some of his most important research for developing the theory of evolution in Singapore. And it's hard to imagine that if Singapore hadn't existed, Wallace could never have achieved what he did in science.
Nature continues to fuel our economy even to today. At the foot of the hill is a tribute to someone who helped to create the cash crop of our modern centuries. Agnes Joachim. Agnes Joachim was born in Singapore to an Armenian family. In the late 1800s, she discovered a new orchid hybrid, which she presented to Henry Whitley.
One of the plant groups that Ridley was very interested in were orchids. He'd studied orchids when he'd been at the British Museum, in the Natural History Museum in London, and so it was natural when he came to Singapore to take an interest in orchids. And in 1893, a lady who was famous for her garden at Tanjong Pagar, Agnes Joachim, came to him with what she thought was something new that had come up in her garden. And we know this today as Vanda Miss Joachim, and indeed Ridley described this formally in a botanical journal in 1893. But actually, the more important thing is that it showed that there was potential to breed new things with orchids.
Orchid breeding and hybridization experiments started in the late 1920s, which led to a new industry in Singapore and eventually in various other Southeast Asian countries. Today, the orchid is a multi-million-dollar industry in Singapore.
A new industry developed based on orchid breeding, and I think orchids now, more than any other plant, symbolize Singapore. When you arrive at Changi Airport as a foreign visitor, what's the first thing you see? Wonderful bunches of orchids, and these are mostly hybrids that have been bred here in Singapore. So it's a new mega industry which has taken over from rubber.
In 1981, Vanda Miss Joachim was selected out of 4 other choices as Singapore's national flower. Agnes Joachim was born in Singapore and died here in 1899. Today, her tombstone lies in the Armenian church, built on land that once was encompassed by the botanical and experimental garden that began more than 190 years ago on the hill.